So I'm in Hawaii with not great internet service. I've had some real challenges with the internet, although I did a Skype call yesterday with France, and the quality was pretty good. There's no lags. So I'm not sure if it's the program I'm using, the Ecamm Live, trying to stream through Periscope. I'm not sure if it's Periscope with just a whole bunch of people trying to do live streams these days, but something's not right. And so just gonna give it another go and maybe just watch this on replay if that's you. So wanted to welcome you. It is Palm Sunday, so for those of you out there who are believers, Christian believers, whether Catholic or Protestant or whatever your faith background is, this is a very big day in the Christian culture. So this is the day that Jesus rode into Jerusalem, the last week of his ministry before he was put to death. So it's particularly during this time, Easter's a week from today, and it'd be a good idea for all of us to kind of take note and just ponder what really went down 2,000 years ago and what it means to us today. I would encourage you to do that this week, regardless of whether you believe it's true or even if you don't believe it's true. I would just say take a look, maybe with a fresh perspective. So I did want to share. So every night we read the Bible to our kids, and they were on Romans 5 the other day, and I read this thing that just jumped out at me for the current environment we're in with this coronavirus. And so here we are, Romans 5, and uh, starting in about verse 2 or so. I'll just read it from the beginning, and it's basically the first 6, 7 verses, something like that. So this is Paul writing a letter to the Romans during Paul's ministry. I'm not going to get too much in the background, but Paul wrote a significant portion of the New Testament for those of you who are not aware. And this was him writing to the Romans. And at that time in history, as you probably have seen from movies depicting the last days of Christ in that time period, the Roman Empire was very, very dominant in this time in history. So this is to the power structures um, in that moment. Anyway, so here's Paul, Romans 5:1. Therefore, since we have been justified through faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have gained access by faith into his grace in which we now stand. And we boast in hope of the glory of God. Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, character, hope. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. You see, at just the right time when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrated his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So that's reading through verse 8. And there's a couple things that jumped out to me. So, number one, we're going through a period of trial right now. And this passage talks about boasting in, or we boast or bring glory in our sufferings because we know that the outcome of that is hope. And it's interesting in our today's culture to think about hope as an outcome. We kind of more think about that as a characteristic that you either have or don't have, whether you're an optimist or a pessimist. But this is discussing hope as an outcome of this mental way of thinking about our current circumstances. And I like that. I like that. Also, it's amazing this verse 6 through 8. At just the right time when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person, someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So while we were still sinners, there's a theme in the New Testament about loving your enemies, about praying for those who persecute you, about the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus' life, which is to die for people who didn't appreciate or understand why he was dying. Um, this to me is the ultimate ethic in Western civilization. I mean, to me. So, what I think is that it helps to understand, especially in today's divided political culture in the U.S. and perhaps other areas as well, that we have a sacrificial love for all of our citizens, and if we don't immediately jump into demonizing or assuming the worst or trying to construct the worst narrative we can possibly find, given the facts that we have. And sadly, I think that that's just happening daily. So you can wake up any given morning and you can read the headlines, and you can find out how people are taking current facts and stringing a narrative in the worst possible light. There's no benefit of the doubt. There's a lot of mind reading. There's a lot of assumption of character. There's a lot of passing judgment on other people. And we'll go through some examples, but I just thought I'd open up with that and get the ball rolling with the discussion this morning. So that jumped out. Oh, and also I just want to talk about dying for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person, someone might possibly die. God demonstrates his love for us in this: while we're still sinners, Christ died for us. To make it strike a chord for us, and I'll use a military example because I'm familiar with that, and I'll also use a political example. First, the military example. So, most Medal of Honor recipients since Vietnam were posthumous, meaning after death. Now, not all. Some, were not, but you typically will get that by some sort of great act of sacrifice, which is, the typical example will be a soldier or a Marine throwing themselves on a live grenade to protect their fellow service members. They die. Their service member, their friends in the unit live, and that ultimate sacrifice is honored with the Medal of Honor. So that's an example of somebody dying for their friends who they love, they cherish, they're on the same team. You can understand that sacrifice because you are sacrificing yourself for the future of those that you love and cherish and relish and respect and have admiration for, and all those things that go along with that. So, but let's change it up a little bit. Let's imagine that a U.S. service member throws themselves on a grenade to protect Iraqi civilians or Afghan civilians. So that changes it up a little bit. Let's go further. Let's imagine that an American service member throws himself on a grenade to protect ISIS or to protect Al Qaeda in Iraq back when I was overseas, or to protect the Taliban. This is literally dying to protect your enemy, right? And this is what the passage is getting to in Romans 5, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. We were literally God's enemies, and he died for us. So, that's the military example. But let's bring it over to a political example. How with the amount of hate that you see on Twitter, can you imagine dying for somebody on the other political side? Could you imagine, or let's scale it back in terms of ultimate cost, but let's say would you put your reputation on the line to protect somebody on the other side? Would you expose yourself to humiliation or to lambasting on Twitter, to cancel culture, anything like that, in order to protect somebody on the other side? Um, and that's, if you look at my pinned tweet, that's kind of what it gets at. Like, what does it look like to love our political opponents? What does it look like to be forgiving in this day and age? So, in honor of Psalm Sunday, I started off Twitter early in the morning. I was up with my daughter. I'm sorry, up with my youngest son, who's 6 months old. My daughter was up. She's two for a little while, but she fortunately went back to get to bed. But my son is teething, and he's uncomfortable during the evening, and so very little sleep for myself and my wife. These last few weeks has been brutal. But when I was up, I said, "Hey, why don't we start off Sunday well?" And so I put out a tweet, and I'm trying to find it. So this is what I said, because coronavirus is obviously trending quite a bit. So I said, "Hey, instead of waking up Sunday morning to find ways to blame each other, maybe we should redirect our efforts to encouraging each other in this trying time." And I put it, I kind of trolled some people, the typical haters that are super critical, and any new information that comes into their filter, their lens, their movie screen is going to, you can kind of predict it's going to just add to their own narrative. It's going to reinforce, it's going to become confirmation bias in their minds, and they're going to reject anything that might be different than what their narrative tells them. So that's what I posted. Um, and then I started reading. There's some good articles. There's a lot of uncertainty now. That's common, and some proposals in the media. But I did want to go to the Washington Post article that I read, that I thought was just exactly this. So Washington Post, America was unprepared for a major crisis. Again, so the big critique, and this is what people like Scott Adams will say, is that it's not really a good argument to say you should have done something sooner, because that applies to everything. If it's something you should have done, you should have done it sooner. Uh, that argument literally applies to every single positive, good decision in your life. If you um, if you made the decision to start dieting on January 1st, 2020, well, you should have done it sooner. That's a trivial example, but this is just drives home. Now, it is true that we were underprepared and ill prepared for this kind of thing. And that's true of not only our country, but other countries as well, as you can see in Europe and other places. So I think that Justin's on here. You should jump on Twitter, Justin. Come on, jump on Periscope. See us. See us. All right. Anyway, so this Washington Post, I just lost it. Okay. So this Washington Post article takes issue with how the administration prepared. And then you can just see it in the headline. You get down into it, and then buried down in the content of the article. So the article is called "Analysis: America was unprepared for a major crisis again." And buried down, it talks about, now you can't really truly be prepared for any crisis fully, because you really don't know what's going to happen. But people uh, in the past, and different administrations, sounded the alarm that, hey, perhaps there's going to be some sort of pandemic coming down the road, and we were underprepared for that. So, hey, you know what? That's true. We were underprepared. Now, people are using that as a bludgeon to as a bat to basically beat Trump with, and to beat the administration with. And there's it's fine. It's fine to do a lessons learned. It's fine. But to then conclude that this person in charge is ill-intentioned or incompetent, I think is trying to prove too much. And what I mean by that, and I replied to this Washington Post article by saying, two observations from this article. Every single big organization, whether you're public sector, private sector, nonprofit, is ill-equipped for most major crises. Uh, and you'll see it. You'll see a public relations disaster that comes out for one of the big companies. You'll see a pivot in the market A great example that I would give because I lived it, as a child. Um, Kodak in upstate New York, Rochester, New York, had no competition for literally 100 years, and then in the 1980s, Fuji Films, whatever the Japanese film company came along, and for the first time in its history, Kodak was faced with competition, and they were ill equipped to handle that competition, and that ultimately led to Kodak filing for bankruptcy and filing, selling off all their intellectual property about 10 or so years ago. Um, and my dad worked for Kodak, so I heard this firsthand coming home. Him coming home from work when I was, a young teenager, and just some of the decision making that Kodak did that didn't make sense. People were sounding the alarm. Hey, we need to adjust this way. We need to adjust that way, and they were right. But that's a point where any organization that gets to a certain level of size, just by the nature of their structure, becomes less agile, less able to adapt to unforeseen circumstances, black swan events. Another thing from the military. So the military, they ingrain into you that we're always fighting the last war. So we are always developing our tactics, techniques, and procedures. We're always developing our strategies, our operations. Um, we're always developing that based on what we learned from the last war. We don't know what the next war is going to be. And so when we find ourselves in the next war, we have to adapt. And you could make this same case the Washington Post is making now, that the military was ill equipped for this war on terror back in, let's say, 2003, 2004. And all those generals should have been fired, right? Because they were ill intentioned. They, they were slow to respond and all this other stuff. And as I recall, that wasn't the conversation. The conversation was, hey, let's make adjustments now. Let's make them quickly so that we can protect our people overseas. And one example of that was up armored Humvees and uh, survivability equipment that they put on aircraft, which literally saved the lives of my friends over there that I served with. So the way the military adjusted is generally positive. They kick into high gear. They get the producers out there to develop the technology that they need, and we're all good. So this criticism, unprepared for a major crisis, cuts every which way you can imagine. So I'm not sure that it's a fair critique, especially if your conclusion is that somebody's incompetent or ill-intentioned in their management of that crisis. So it seems to me to be that's kind of the angle that the opposition to the current administration is taking, and I just don't think that's necessarily accurate or fair. Now I understand it. I understand it. It's easy because if it was the flip side, what little bit of whataboutism, if it was Obama, dealing with, let's say, Benghazi, uh, I would say you should have done this sooner. You should have done blah 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 blah. Now, for the record, I held off a little bit on judgment because oftentimes your initial reaction to things is very emotional. You got to wait about 24 hours, sometimes longer, maybe a couple days, to really get a sense of what the facts were on the ground and understand what the decision making was that transpired given those facts. So I understand that when you're in the minority, you're not in power, that the tendency to do that is going to be higher. And I saw it on the right as well during the 8 years of Obama. So anyway, and then the second criticism I had to looking back 2020 hindsight, we were underprepared, and boy, the demonizing and the haters are in full force on this talking point. And I said most of the criticisms boiled down to Trump leadership style. He made decisions as a leader, trade-offs about which administration positions he was going to fill, which ones he was going to do away with, which ones he was going to consolidate, which ones he was going to leave unfilled, and and he had a lot of turnover too with some of the early task force that I guess were looking at this issue, and that's a leadership style. Turnover in an organization is a leadership style. It is. You have high turnover. It could be because the leadership is very difficult to work with. You might have people who stay for years and years and years because they, have that good. They understand the management style, the leadership style. They thrive in that environment. You have others where it just doesn't work, and they're looking for the quickest exit out the door. Um, and you see that literally everywhere. You see that in every organization. You see, you see different reactions to different leadership styles. So to me, this all boils down to criticisms of Trump as a leader, which is fine. But that's different than saying he's incompetent or inept. Those are different. Those are different critiques. You can't say because I object to his leadership style, therefore he's incompetent or inept. I don't think it works that way. So that was my response to this Washington Post article. Now onto the coronavirus. What are we at here? So Bloomberg tweeted out some stats early this morning when I was up. Now I'm in Hawaii, so it's probably you know probably old news to many of you. But we're at 1.2 million global cases. We're at 68,000 deaths. U.S. cases are at about 321,000, so we're about a quarter of the world total right now. And that's where we are. So that's crazy. And we were told by our government that things are going to get worse the next week or two, and I would expect to see that continue. And obviously, that ramps up anxiety and questioning in different people's minds. So a couple of other pieces, the Financial Times had this article, which was basically suggesting that we need to change course in how the government interacts with the economy out of this disaster. And so I read it and I thought that's an interesting take. And basically they were suggesting a much larger proactive intervention type role, a la the 1930s and 1940s with the New Deal and World War II, and how a lot of decisions were made in real time during those two crises that that the outcome of which was for the next 25, 30 years until basically the Reagan era, which kind of changed course. So I read it, and it was a pretty interesting take, and I'm trying to find it, but having trouble finding it. Financial Times. Okay, so yeah, so the quote is reversing the prevailing policy direction of the last 4 decades will need to be put on the table. Governments will have to accept a more active role in the economy. And so I understand it. My favorite Democratic candidate was Andrew Yang. I really liked him. I thought he was a smart guy. Uh, I was sympathetic to the UBI concept, the universal basic income, the freedom dividend, as he calls it. Uh, Having studied Milton Friedman years over the last 10 years or so, I was familiar that Milton Friedman made the case for universal basic income during his lectures and during his time in academia. So sympathetic with it as an alternative to the welfare state. You put money directly in people's pockets, then they certainly could make poor choices with it, but they could also make much better choices than some bureaucracy standing in the way, trying to give them services that they may or may not need. They can be more of the consumer at that point and select the services that they may think that they need for themselves or for their family. So I'm very sympathetic to that. Uh, but this article in the Financial Times was basically advocating for a much larger role of government in the economy. And as I was thinking about this, I was thinking, well, what difference would that have made in this crisis? So let's say we did have Medicare for all. Let's say we did have a bigger footprint in the economy for the federal government. Like, what would that have accomplished differently? Would that simply have made it easier to do this bailout of the American people, the stimulus package? Would it have made it easier? Would If you had a mechanism for UBI, would that make the money flow easier? Those are probably true, but I'm not persuaded that they need to take more decision-making power in the economy necessarily. Um, so anyway, that was something the Financial Times wrote, and they're kind of a conservative, well, I guess economically conservative publication that made this suggestion. Um, and the subtitle is "The Virus Lays Bare the Frailty of the Social Contract." Excuse me, virus lays bare the frailty of the social contract, which I do think is valid. So um, anyway, so I'm not persuaded. I'm open to the idea, but I know that a lot of this discussion is going to happen the next 3, 4, 6 weeks, whatever, however long it takes, and probably a long time afterwards, probably all the way through November in the presidential election. Do we need to reassess where we are as a society, as a culture? And if you listen to people like Gavin Newsom in California or others who openly say this is an opportunity for us to promote our own agendas, our own progressive, democratic, liberal agenda in the country, they're taking advantage of the crisis to do that. Some think that's the right tactic. Others, like me, think maybe that's not the best tactic. A dialogue about it is fine as long as you have the hearts and minds of people and you persuade them that your view is correct in the marketplace of ideas. Hey, game on, fair game. Let's discuss it. So that's out there. What else did I see in the last 12 hours, 24 hours? So Glenn Greenwald, who I follow on Twitter, had this really funny quote, and this is kind of in line with some of the things I've been talking about. He said, "The key to success in politics is talking only to the people who already agree with you about everything and are fully on your side, and ignoring or shunning everyone else because that makes them disappear." So this is funny because Twitter falls in this line, right? You have the Washington Post uh, article that came out that I just mentioned, or the Financial Times. So it's frustrating. It just kicked me off because of the stupid stream again. I might have to record these and then upload them, but I don't want to take the time to do that. So um, anyway, what I was saying was that these echo chambers that form in social media make it hard to break in and talk to other people, because you just put up a statement that demonizes, that reveals a confirmation bias of the source of information you're commenting on, and there's no one failing that I've noticed in the media is there's no honest presentation of both sides of the issue, and they don't steel man the opposing point of view. They very rarely do that, and that was probably true journalism, or in the Platonic sense, the form of journalism, the highest pure form of journalism would be, hey, present both sides of the argument, make them as strong as possible, and then let the reader decide. And maybe in your presentation of those ideas, people might find out where you come out on the issue, but you at least know what the other side what the other side's position is. And so this is a good test for you. This is a good test for you as you're consuming media. Go ahead and find out if in the information that's being presented to you, whether it's an article or a cable news show or an internet uh, repeating show, another Periscope, find out if it's truly showing you the the different points of view. Ask yourself, okay, I've been presented with one side of the argument. What's on the other side of the argument? Is there any information in this article that lends itself to supporting the other side of the argument? If there's not, now you have a choice. You can try to imagine and brainstorm what possible other side arguments there might be. Now, you might be wrong, and none of those might be the accurate alternative argument. But just the idea of imagining it or brainstorming what the opposing point of view could be, and there might be 3 or 4 different options, is going to make you a better thinker. It's going to make you a better critical thinker, and it's going to help you not assume the worst of people um, by imagining possible frames of reference. And if there's one thing that people are not very good at these days, it's that. And so you can imagine it, or you can go to another news source and actually listen to an alternative perspective, listen to the alternative point of view, which has the same problem. They will make their case very, very strong, and they will minimize or even not even mention maybe the opposing argument, although some do that better than others. So have at it. That's a test. Go see if you can put that into practice. All right. So what else? I'm on almost 30 minutes, I think, and I got cut off midstream, so that's frustrating. But I follow Scott Adams. I think what he said has been really interesting, and I was talking to a new friend that I met on Twitter yesterday who lives out in France, Greg, and we were talking about Scott Adams' book, How to Fail at Nearly Everything and Still Win Big, which was his first book that I read, and changed Greg's life, he relayed to me. And one of the things that changed my life about that book is that he made an observation that we all have realms of knowledge. We all have these circles of knowledge that pertain to what we've studied in school, where we live, who we interact with, who we communicate with, the topics we've studied, the disciplines we've studied, and we all will have, almost by definition, limited frames of reference with which to judge material coming out of a realm of knowledge that we're not that familiar with. And so you'll see this quite a bit with non-economists critiquing economic input or economists critiquing medical input. You know, the case today is the economic argument versus the medical argument for when to reopen the economy. And so he made a really good observation that the more realms of knowledge that you've studied, the better suited you are to think critically about matters of policy, matters of culture, matters of of life. And if you've really isolated yourself to a narrow focus, whether it's an education or profession or whatnot, then it's not a criticism. You just simply don't have necessarily the exposure to other banks of knowledge that might be pertinent to your judgment on a particular topic. So instead, you rely on more emotion based. And that book made me a strong believer that humans are 90% emotion and about 10% logic or reason. And we could get in more into that as this continues, but that's my assessment. So he made that observation and how to fail at nearly everything and win big, and that really just struck me home because my background, you know, I was an engineering major in college. I got an engineering degree. I was a performance arts acting minor, so I had the science kind of logical thinking on the one hand, and then I had the artistic side on the other hand. And when I left college, which is a liberal college, like most situations back in the day, I went to the military, which is very conservative. So I got exposed to a conservative culture, and that brought me to a whole bunch of different states. I lived in a whole bunch of different states in a short period of time, and I saw a whole bunch of different cultures. So I got exposed to a whole bunch of different ways of thinking about things, different silos, if you like, in American culture. And when I left the military, I went back to Los Angeles and tried the artistic thing again. So I did that for a while. Then I went to grad school and I studied policy. And then after policy, I did a startup, tried to do a startup. That failed. And then after that, I joined a small business out in Hawaii and built a business. I doubled it and helped double it in size. And so I had a whole unique, different realms of knowledge that I had tapped into over that 20-year arc that make me reserve judgment more so than, say, a person who's been a writer their whole life or a reporter their whole life or who has only studied, you know, only studied engineering and has a PhD in engineering. Nothing, again, this is not a critique against those people. This is merely an observation that when you're narrow in focus, then you may be isolating yourself from information that might be pertinent to making choices and making decisions and accurate predicting observations about the state of things. So that's my critique of the comments to all this content that you see that would support somebody's confirmation bias with regard to how the current leadership is doing on this issue. What else? So that was the Washington Post, talked about Bloomberg. So I'll read my pinned tweet just so you have a frame of reference for what I've discussed up to this point. But my pinned tweet right now is: you may have heard it said that love conquers all, or that perfect love casts out fear. That's a verse from the Bible. So what does it look like to love our political opponents? Asking for a friend. I think that we could choose to wake up this Holy Week, you know, like I said, Psalm Sunday. We could choose to wake up tomorrow and look for ways to encourage each other across the aisle, across the political divide, across the cultural divide, across the economic divide, to be encouraging of each other, to be understanding, to be open, as opposed, and sadly this is going to happen tomorrow just like it did today, as opposed to waking up and finding out what the current news cycle looks like and how the current news cycle fits into our own prior beliefs. And those prior beliefs being to more material to demonize and to demagogue and to uh, find the worst possible, least charitable interpretation of events and not even consider charitable options. And that's what I mean by a failure of imagination, having both sides presented. The charitable position would steelman the opposition side. And one thing I'll say before I go is that when I was in high school, I think my sophomore year, I took this European history class, AP European history. And it was such a life changing class for me because the lecturer, the teacher, I still remember her. She was one of my favorite teachers in high school. She had a weekly seminar where you would prepare two sides of an issue. Typically, there was different ways that the seminars worked. You could role play different historical people and get a sense for what their philosophies were and what their thinking was. But let's say it was a debate, and I remember the first debate was, uh, did a Renaissance happen? Did the Renaissance actually happen? That was the question, and you as a student had to show up prepared with both sides. So you had to make a very strong steelman case for yes, the Renaissance did happen. You had to make a very strong steelman case for no, the Renaissance didn't happen. That was just a kind of a it was more just a gradual change over many centuries. It wasn't one big thing. It was just a number of individual small things. And and you show up to the seminar, and she goes, "Okay, you're on yes, and you're on no," and so you get assigned at the lecture at the seminar. So you can't know which side you're going to argue. So you have to present both sides as strongly as possible. And that was really eye opening for me. It relates a little bit to what I did as an actor and why I really enjoyed that profession, really enjoyed that discipline, because you might be called upon to play a role that is completely alien to you as a person, completely different, not even the same way of thinking that you would think, who would take actions that you would never, ever consider yourself, maybe actions of violence, maybe actions of hatred or something else that you can't even imagine a scenario where you yourself would do that. And the only way to really be convincing to the audience as an actor is to make that character real for you. So you have to make it really strong, the reasons, whether you judge them as legitimate or not, you have to make really strong the reasons to make that real, to make that truth for you. And when I did not do that, I had, some of my harshest critiques, if you like, from whether it was an acting teacher, acting coach, or a theater company that I was with in LA. I and the two examples is I had to play a person who was gay on two different occasions, one in college and one much, much later when I was living in Los Angeles. And the first case, I embraced it. I made it, what it was, and it was very, very, very convincing. It came across very truthfully. And even 10 years later, my acting teacher still remembers that scene. She remembers me. She remembers that scene. And then I did it in LA much, much later, and I made a different choice. I didn't make it as truthful for me, again, playing a gay guy at this point as opposed to way back when. And the critique was, and it came out in the performance. So all that to say that, the discipline of acting can actually force you to get into somebody else's shoes and to steel man their position to make it truthful. I mean, that's really the only way you can do it, honestly, in my view. But sadly, actors forget that when they get out of the role job and they get into the social commentary job or critiquing public figures or whatnot. They truly forget that. Anyway, I was very influenced by this AP European history course back as a sophomore in high school. And where do you see that today? Where do you see both sides getting articulately presented, steel manned, to the point where you're like, yeah, that's a good point. And oh, that other side has a good point. Wow, I don't really know which way I come out on this. As opposed to that other side can't possibly have anything valuable to say. I'm just going to shut her up in my box here because I'm comfortable with all these people who agree with me, and I'm just going to ignore this other side and say that they're all sycophants of Trump, and that they all are culpable with blood on their hands. And that's some of the dumb comments that go out there on Twitter. I'm sure you've all seen it if you're on Twitter. Anyway, I think that's it. That's about a little over 30 minutes between these two videos. I hope you guys have a great Psalm Sunday. And I know there's only one person who logged in to view this live because I'm still trying to test out this feed to see how it works. But other than that, God bless. Uh, Thanks for coming with me on this journey to get a little bit better at this a little bit each day. I'll try to do it. It's hard. Family is demanding with 4 young children. They're awesome. I love them to death. It's a lot of work. But anyway, love to all, and I will talk to you later.